Now, it's been a very interesting Easter week, which we began with the death of Pope Francis, as we've been hearing is continuing to lie in state in St. Peter's Basilica. Then there was Donald Trump's latest pronouncements on Ukraine amid more Russian attacks, and housing once again hitting the front pages. So with us this week to talk about it all, Emer Higgins of Fine Gael, Minister of State for Public Procurement, Digitalisation and eGovernment, Paul Murphy of People Before Profit, and Jane Matthews, Political Correspondent for the Journal.ie. Good morning and welcome one and all. We'll start with the Pope. I mean, his death was not unexpected, I suppose. It was sudden but not unexpected, Paul.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I'm not a very keen follower of Catholic Church
You
affairs,
can't avoid
but
that.
you certainly
week.
can't avoid the coverage of it now. And I was aware that he was sick, and obviously, you know, significant numbers of people in this country and probably hundreds of millions of people around the world are mourning, and I absolutely respect that. I mean, for me, I suppose there's kind of two sides of the Pope's legacy. Like, it's definitely, without being a keen follower of church affairs, it's clear that the Pope was significantly more progressive than his predecessors. And the things that stood out to me was his position in terms of climate change. I actually went and kind of reread through the Laudate Deum that he released, I think, before COP28. And it was very striking, where he's calling out the system based on profit as being responsible for climate change and calling on the world's leaders to stop their inaction. Obviously, recently, in relation to Gaza, he's been very principled, consistent voice, calling out the genocide.
And Donald Trump extraordinarily said he was, and this is the quote, looking forward to going to the funeral. I mean, it's not the appropriate language, but I mean, a cynic would say he's going over to make sure the Pope is dead, because the Pope opposed him on Gaza, the Pope opposed him
on asylum seekers and refugees, and speaking out about those things. And obviously the one who saw him last before he died was J.D. Vance. I mean, I think that the interesting thing is that, in a way, it speaks to how the political system has shifted to the right over the past number of years, that Pope Francis looked like some sort of progressive radical, because he wasn't really. I mean, he was an opponent of liberation theology in Argentina. He was still very conservative in the terms of the role of women in the church. Justine McCarthy had a very good piece earlier on this week saying how he was saying, well, you know, the church is a spouse and women have a particular role and it's definitely not to be ministers and so on.
But he was pushing a massive boulder up a hill.
Yes, and in terms of dealing with the legacy of his predecessors, both in terms of, you know, the Panama Papers, what was revealed, whole kind of slush funds, this kind of thing. And in fairness to Pope Francis, seemed to have an approach which was much more about humility. I think that's why he chose the name, not this big splurging and so on. But I do think, unfortunately, in a way, the fact that he looked so good is a reflection of how dark things have become.
Now, Jane, the abiding image that will stay with me from this week in reference to the Pope's death is Donald Trump announcing it in the Rose Garden during the Easter egg roll with the Easter bunny beside him.
I know.
The wife on one side, the Easter bunny on the other. Quite bizarre.
Totally bizarre. I saw the headline and I had to kind of go and find the image for myself. I didn't quite believe it. And it's just so Trumpian, isn't it? Like, I mean, you know, we're kind of, he always has this ability to shock. And I think, yeah, I was reading back over some of the coverage from the last comparable event like this when Pope John Paul died 20 years ago now, in April 2005. And that at the time was dubbed the diplomatic event of the year. And I think we're going to see similar this weekend. You have a huge amount of world leaders going over for the funeral on Saturday, up to 170 foreign delegations going from Ireland. We'll have the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach, and the President will be there to pay their respects.
Yeah, is that a bit of overkill, if you don't mind me using that phrase? 3 people going? Taoiseach, Taoiseach, and the head of state?
I'm not sure. I mean, you could make the argument either way, I suppose. They would argue that it isn't overkill. But I think it's interesting. Paul mentioned Justine McCarthy there. She had another great piece in the Irish Times today about the kind of some of the hypocrisy maybe of world leaders that are going over to pay their respects to this man who has talked about the need to address climate change. He's called out Trump specifically for his policies around asylum seekers, and then to sit there and pay their respects. It is just an interesting thing to witness, I suppose.
Emer?
I think it's right that we are sending a delegation to the funeral. Our president, our Taoiseach and our Taoiseach. I think it's right that we'll be flying the flag.
Is this not
at
about the
half-mast.
coalition parties, each one having to get their face before the cameras?
No.
I mean, really, the Taoiseach and the president Even that, maybe the president would have been sufficient, or the Taoiseach would have been sufficient.
Listen,
I
perhaps,
don't want to
but at the
begrudge
same
them
time,
their trip to this very historic moment, but it does seem like a little bit over the top.
I don't think so. I mean, we're a country that 69% of people self-classify as Catholic. 3.5 million Irish people are. That's an awful lot of people who are feeling the loss of Pope Francis. I think it's right that we're sending a delegation there to represent us at that time. I think it's right that we will be flying the flag at half-mast over government buildings tomorrow during the service. And I think that's absolutely the appropriate thing to do. Obviously, we'll be watching over the next couple of weeks what happens in terms of the election of a new pope. I personally speaking, I love the tradition of the election and the conclave and everything that brings, but I also love that Pope Francis has departed from tradition, not just for the sake of it, but for really meaningful reasons. And I think that gives us a glimpse into the person he is. And for example, I suppose around the burial and how he's being buried in a church that he visited every time he came home from a papal visit.
The conclave, we'll obviously in the coming weeks be talking about that, but it'll be interesting, dominated in terms of the electorate, not those present, because even the cardinals over 80 are allowed to be there, and any one of them can be elected pope. But the majority of those who have a vote were appointed by Pope Francis, and they're from all over the world. Every part of the world will be represented.
Yeah, and I guess that creates some possibility that obviously he was anticipating this moment, and the possibility that the next pope will be in the same sort of spirit in terms of,
it's a bit
and
like,
there is a fight.
In a parallel way, it's a bit like Donald Trump appointing hundreds and hundreds of federal judges. So his legacy will live after him.
Yeah. And there is clearly, again, I'm not like inside this, but there clearly is a struggle inside the church. I mean, there are like very high profile American Catholics who are viciously opposed to, or was viciously opposed to Pope Francis, suggested he was a kind of illegitimate pope, the same kind of Trumpism reflecting itself within the Catholic Church. So there is that obviously present. I would be hopeful that you have someone who will continue
Marjorie
to...
Taylor Greene, when reacting to the Pope's death, said, "God has worked to take evil out of the world."
Wow, I hadn't heard that. That's quite something.
Now, whether she meant it quite in that way, it's the way it's being understood, that she figured the Pope was an evil influence. Bizarre. Anyway, we will move on. President Zelensky will be present, and so will Donald Trump. What will that mean potentially for peace talks? Jane?
Yeah, it'll be really interesting. I think there'll be an eye on some of the discussions that go on the sidelines of the Pope's funeral. This week has been an extraordinary week in terms of the war in Ukraine. We've seen Russia, increase its bombardment of Kiev. Some of the deadliest strikes that we've seen since last year. And we have this pressure now from Donald Trump, who is saying that he wants to see a peace deal agreed. He's saying he's got his own timeline in mind. He hasn't actually said when that is, but the understanding
he did say 24 hours before he was elected.
Yeah, and it seems as though he wants it before he reaches his 100 days in office next week. So it seems to be about Donald Trump more so than about Ukraine or Russia. And even the details of that plan, we don't. It hasn't been published yet. We don't know the full ins and outs, but there's been a lot of briefings on it.
It's easy to get agreement from Russia if you're giving Russia everything Russia wants. So easy. Paul?
Yes. I mean, I think the Ukrainian people here are really going to be the victims of an old-style, naked imperialist carve-up between Trump on the one side, who's eager to get his hands on the rare earths, the minerals, and Putin on the other hand, who wants the land. And unfortunately, like, the Ukrainian people have been used in a war to try and weaken the position of Russian imperialism. NATO has egged that on, has been willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, and now utterly betrayed by the US because their own interests now no longer align. They want to pivot to Asia. It's obviously horrendous. I mean, I think, a big question here is the question of Crimea. And obviously, the just answer in terms of Crimea is allow the people to decide. Allow the return of refugees.
They've been involved in plantations but that's exactly the same as in Ireland,
But that's why we need the right of return of refugees, not happening under a gun. I mean, you did have a referendum in Crimea, which overwhelmingly went to be with Russia, but that was in the context of Russian occupation. But the people should be allowed to decide. That's what a just peace would look like.
Constitutionally, though, we were talking about it earlier, the Ukrainian constitution forbids that, Emer. They cannot hand over Crimea to Russia
Yes,
under their constitution.
that's the
Even if
constitutional decision.
Zelensky wanted to, against, I'm sure, the emotion of the people, if he wanted to concede that, he really can't in law.
Yeah, he may well have to go to the people to do that. And that's, I suppose, a matter for Ukraine. I think what we need to make sure is that the right people are around the table to negotiate a way forward for this. I think President Zelensky has shown his willingness to negotiate, but he's also shown his steeliness too. And that's important because, it's important that Ukraine not only gets peace, but gets a just peace out of this. And I suppose it's up to President Zelensky. And I mean, we're seeing the negotiations happen through President Trump to some degree at the moment. But it's up to him to ascertain what he believes is a just peace for his people in the context of what's happening. I mean, there's people being bombarded day and night in Ukraine with bombs, and peace has to be what happens, but it has to come.
It's very hard to see a way forward
paid.
because Sergei Lavrov, even talking about those attacks in Ukraine, has been playing on all news media since he said it to CBS News that they only target civilian targets where they know the Ukrainian military have a presence and therefore it becomes justified, and they leave it to the commanders in the field. Yet when you stand back from it, it's deliberate targeting of Kiev by Putin.
No question. It's just like what Israel does in Gaza. It's the same sort of
Precisely, yeah.
excuses, and the media should treat them the same way in terms of not giving any weight to the propaganda that comes from Moscow or that comes from Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. But again, it's the Ukrainians who are the victims in all of this. And their voices aren't even going to be heard at the negotiating table, really. Like, that's what's clear. But also the reality is that, there is a limit to which Ukraine is going to be able to continue to fight. There's clearly massive war weariness. There's a real difficulty. And, people have seen the videos of conscripts being kind of pulled out of nightclubs and so on. People clearly know that, it is not going to happen that they're going to push Russia back to the pre-existing borders and then go pre-existing again in terms of Crimea, which is over 10 years ago now. That's a reality.
If you allow Russia to keep what it has at the moment, it provides them, if you like, with a new front line for the next phase whenever they feel strong enough and recover their economy enough to have another go.
It does. And I suppose that's where the question of accession comes in, accession to the European Union, because things are very different. If we bring about a peace deal and Ukraine becomes a member of the EU, things become very different going forward. And I suppose that's why we need the EU to step up. That's why we need the EU to support Ukraine, not just now, but
Would you
through
support
peace.
Hungary being ejected from the EU?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's difficult, to be honest, because we know a lot of
We
what
don't have a
Hungary
mechanism at the
espoused.
moment,
Yeah.
but we might have to have another treaty referendum to make it happen. But Orban is, if you like, a fifth columnist within the EU.
You're right in what you say. I mean, Orban has definitely spoke very differently to how the rest of the EU has on this. And I think that's actually something that is worth exploring. But what we need to make sure is that countries that are like-minded, that do stand with Ukraine on this, that actually put their foot forward here, whether that's through finances, whether that's through aid, whether that's through backup to
Jane?
Ukraine.
Yeah, I think it's been notable that the EU has been kind of absent from any of these discussions this week in the news report. It's all been the focus, it's all been on what the US is saying, the US plan. I thought it was striking to see that former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, even he came out and criticised Trump's plans. And he's been, he's a good friend of Trump. We know he's been a supporter of him in the past. But he was criticising it and saying that under the US proposals, Ukraine will get nothing. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens now next week, where the EU comes back into the conversation and if
the
it
UK,
will be able to.
the EU isn't in the same position as it was before Brexit. And I think the UK and the EU together have a serious role to play.
Now, moving on to local matters and housing in the news on a number of fronts this week. Social targets for housing not being achieved by the government's housing programme. The Airbnb story this morning from the SRI saying Airbnb is not going to help solve the problem. And any idea of extending the help to buy scheme to second-hand homes would probably cause an increase in prices. Emer.
Listen, houses are being built. They're not being built fast enough. We absolutely accept that. We did deliver 30,000 new homes last year. Commencements almost doubled last year to 60,000. We've 500 first-time buyers every week drawing down their first mortgages. We see it when you go around Dublin in particular. You see hoardings up, boots on the ground, cranes in the sky. What we need to do is accelerate that. And there's policies now being put into action by the new government to make sure that at a policy level we're
didn't
accelerating
hit
that.
the targets last year, and I don't know whether you'll hit them this year. But then we have this the business of trying to get people to downsize and other mechanisms like Airbnb to try and solve the government's housing problem.
It's
You're saying to people who are making a few bob in the countryside from Airbnb, and ESRI has shown that in most of the holiday areas, they are not available for full-time letting. They are part-time, earn a few bob for the family who own the accommodation. That's what's happening there. So Airbnb not going to be the panacea, and throwing older people out of their houses to make way for families, bigger families.
Firstly,
I mean, I know it's not being forced.
I don't think that's fair.
No, but
nobody's being forced.
These are the policies that are being put out there to solve the housing problem, and that's not the solution.
They're part of the solution, and they're part of the policies being used. So that report that you've referred to earlier, which was a joint report between the Department of Housing and the ESRI, has said that the registration that we're going to be now making mandatory, that Fáilte Ireland will be using and will be overseeing for Airbnbs, will be crucial for ensuring a balanced approach to regulation that looks at both the need for tourist attraction and the need for private rental. And that's a direct quote from it. I mean, it has about 4 different recommendations there, all of which have been taken on board by policy and all of which are policy.
What do you make of it, Jane?
Yeah, I think so. The top line from the ESRI report today for me was that it found that Airbnb listings, increased Airbnb listings, are not the root cause of rental property shortages in Ireland. I think a lot of people would say, fair. I don't think anyone was claiming that they were. But I mean, we know that the government has said themselves that up to 12,000 properties could be brought back into the housing market by regulating Airbnb. And I think my sense since the election is, we're talking about missed social housing targets there. If we look back on that, like the social housing targets for last year were missed by almost 18%. It's a huge shortfall. And then if we look at the targets last year in general, the government missed the housing targets for almost 10,000 homes. That's massive. And I just think overall, if you look since the election, it doesn't feel like this is being treated like a crisis. Housing, it's a long-standing crisis in this country, and I think even if you look at what's happened since the general election, since the start of this year, I don't think we can point to a huge amount of movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think the government has really given up on addressing the housing crisis. I think what we're seeing is just they've decided to just spoof in terms of figures. We've had it like multiple examples now. So in the last election, obviously, we've had a lot of coverage correctly about the fact that they were saying 40,000, we were going to hit 40,000. They knew they weren't going to hit it. And of course, then we were at 30,000. Then we had the figures yesterday. So the government admits that they missed their social housing target. That's 4 years out of the last 5 they've missed the housing targets. The only one, they missed it in 2020. They hit it in 2021. They missed it in 2022, 23, and 24. And let's remember, these are inadequate targets that are not enough to deal with it. But the other thing, the government yesterday in their press statement on affordable housing, the same thing, they said, unfortunately we missed the social housing, but we achieved the affordable housing target. It's simply not true. I mean, they're claiming the target was 6,400 and they hit 7,126, but they're including over 4,000 homes there that simply should not be included. They're approving first home approval figures, so they're approvals, not bills. They're including vacant property refurbishment grants that have no element of affordability in it and were never previously included. And they're including cost rental tenant in situ scheme, which again shouldn't be included because there is no element of affordability. People are saying paying the same rents as they would have been before. So there's just really an attempt to juke the stats pretending they're achieving something when actually the crisis is worsening.
Cost rental is part of our affordability model. In terms of this idea that people have given up, absolutely not. Since the new government came into being not long ago at this point, I can point to a number
substantially the old
of
government. This is the nonsense about new governments. You have to carry the legacy of previous acts.
Absolutely. And for example, let me give you one of those, the Planning and Development Act, which was something that the last government brought in and which now we're working to put.
Which is a license for lawyers to make fortunes. It's too complex. You walked away, and it was Darragh O'Brien who walked away from the opportunity to simplify the process. Instead, he made it infinitely more complex.
I don't believe so.
And
I sat on that housing committee for many, many hours and many long days and many long nights. So I know that bill in detail. And I do think that there's an awful lot of opportunity within it. And I think it will speed up planning decisions. And we've now doubled the staffing on board Pleanála to make that happen as well. We also have now announced the Strategic Housing Activation Office, which is literally going to be about unblocking the blockages when it comes to infrastructure delays, things like utility. I mean, we know these are the issues, that the ESB and the Irish water connections are slowing things down. We're now going to have an accelerated task force with seconded experts from the ESB and Irish Water to help us unblock those issues.
How many years has it taken all of this to dawn on you?
I mean, there's different initiatives being done over the last 5 years. I don't think this idea that, oh, well, you didn't do that before, why are you only doing it now? That's not a reason to not do these things. We need to do these things because we need to accelerate the progress we've made.
Jane,
we know homes are being built, but we want them
you?
to be built faster. That's what this accelerated programme is all about.
I think people at home will be thinking we hear about these different schemes, we hear about cost rental, we hear about all these different types of affordable homes, social homes, and people go, well, in reality, what does this mean for me? Like, how, you know, I'm on a housing list, or I'm a first-time buyer trying to buy a home. My grandchildren are struggling to save and build up a deposit to buy a home, and they feel like there's no respite there for people. It doesn't feel like the situation's improving. And Pat, you mentioned some of the housing supports that are there for first-time buyers and the warnings that the government has received around the Help to Buy scheme and the First Home scheme, and how these are actually inflating house prices. I can tell you, as someone who's thinking about buying a house in Dublin, house prices are sky high. A lot of the new build homes that are out there, they don't even qualify for the Help to Buy scheme because they're over. I mean, you know, to qualify for the Help to Buy scheme, they have to be under €500,000. The property has to be under €500,000. A lot of the new build 3-bedroom homes in Dublin are over that. So, you know, you're out of it anyway.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. If you go back to 2016, the government was then promising to end homelessness. People will remember that famous interview with Simon Coveney, who said no one will be in hotels after, I think it was July 2016. That was obviously forgotten. There's more families than ever growing up or raising their kids in hotels. Over 4,000 children will go to bed tonight in hotel rooms or other forms of emergency accommodation. The figures are going up and up and up. At the time of the 2016 election, we had 5,000 people homeless. 2020, we had 10,000 homeless. Now we're over 15,000. And I really think the government has... The strategy is to just normalise this and say this is just like the health crisis. You know, sure, it's always there, and what can you do about it? And like the government is making it worse. Like, for example, the floating of the idea that we're going to bring in extra tax breaks for developers. There's every chance that has slowed down developers, because developers are saying, well, hang on a bit. Maybe we'll get tax incentives if we don't do it this year.
It's like we have permission for a 6-story block. Maybe we'll get to 8 if we hang on a bit.
Exactly. And like the answer, I mean, the Housing Commission report, which calls for a radical reset of housing, that is not happening. The government is digging in deeper to the same policies, which is about incentivising the market. And instead, we need to say the market is not working.
Paul, I believe, and we've said it many times in the programme, that a rules-based situation for planning would solve a lot of problems. Because the locals know what the rules are, the developer knows what the rules are, the council knows what the rules are. And if you fit within the rules, you can build. And the government walked away from that. They want to be able to interfere and tinker and mess about.
Yes,
they won't accept a rules-based system.
Like the example, and Emer would know it, is City West. So in City West, you've just apartment block after apartment block going up, most of them being built to rent. They were all outside in terms of densities, facilities, community infrastructure, outside a decent local plan set by the council, and were all done through the strategic housing development process, whereby they got to fast track, and you're not building livable communities by doing so. You know, we need to build more homes. We need to build livable communities where people want to live and so on.
A final postscript on this. It is disgraceful and appalling in 2025 that we have a housing crisis. When we didn't have a cent in the 40s and 50s, we built houses. It's a political disgrace. I don't know what the solution is. We've talked about it long enough. But for the moment, anyway, my thanks to Emer Higgins, TD, Minister of State for Public Procurement, Digitalisation and eGovernment, Gael, Dublin Midwest TD, Paul Murphy, TD, People Before Profit from Dublin Southwest, and Jane Matthews, Political Correspondent at thejournal.ie.